G'day, mates. And today we're going to be talking about my recent exchange with the Creationist Indiana Jones / Crocodile Dundee cosplaying duo wannabe expeditionary adventurers John Mackay and Indiana Joe Hubbard. He really calls himself Indiana Joe. You can't make this up. And these are two Australian creationists who have made the rounds for decades now, associating with a fellow Australian creationist, Ken Ham, until splintering apart and doing their own thing. John Mackay's arguments against Richard Dawkins have garnered thousands of views here on YouTube. And when the opportunity came up for me to be able to speak with them, I was told that I would have about 20 minutes of this exchange. Now, ultimately, I had less than half of that amount of time during the recent open mic over on Standing for Truth's channel, but that's fine. I didn't get to ask any of the questions that I actually wanted to ask them about the fossil record. That's fine too, whatever. I ended up taking the bait. They said, oh, all the people on this open mic, nobody's brought up any evidence actually for evolution, when really I came there to just totally debunk their notions of how the Noah's flood caused the fossil record that we see today, which is obviously impossible. I wanted to bring up the fossil record of plankton or pollen, or why we don't have cetaceans like dolphins and whales in the same layer that we find big marine reptiles like mosasaurs that occupied the same environments. I wanted to ask them all these questions about their ridiculous flood model, but none of that ended up happening because right at the very end, he said, oh, I'm going to have to leave. Notice how none of the evolutionists even brought forward any actual evidence for evolution. And I was like, well, wait, I've been waiting this whole time to get my 20 minutes with him. He's about to leave. Might as well just put forward some actual evidence for evolution. And that's what I did here.
All of you who are listening, have you noticed so far we have not had anybody present any evidence of evolution? Very important. Have you noticed so far we have not had anybody disagree with the devolution of things or offer evidence that the world is going in any other way?
Hey, John, I can make an argument for evolution before you go.
Go right ahead, mate.
Okay, yeah. How do you explain how we're able to predict transitional fossils before they're found? Like the actual anatomy that these fossils have, whether this was therapsids, Tiktaalik, Archaeopteryx. How is it that using evolution, we can predict these transitional anatomies before we find them?
Most probably because the creatures who occupy different levels of the what you'd call the environment need scaled up versions of what facilities they have. But none of your statements tell you that A turned into part B, turned into B, turned into part C. None of that is actually evidence of change itself. You've got evidence of different morphologies which you arrange as transitional. Now, unless you lived side by side with them and watched them transition, you are making an absolutely fabricated case.
Can I make a point on that really quickly? Because I see this in a lot of debates between evolutionists and creationists. Proving or disproving teleology.
Now, at this point, this is the detriment to having an open mic, is that lots of people can just interject, and we kind of got off with just a 1v1. We go into a minute or two talking about presuppositionalism and teleology. I'll just edit that out and get back to where I try to get the conversation focused back on transitions.
I'm going to hand it to Grayson. Did you have a follow-up? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up with how you responded to my point about transitional fossils being predicted, because I don't think that what you brought up is actually relevant. I asked you how we're able to predict these beforehand. I'm not asking about assuming one thing came to another, one thing was ancestral or whatever. That's just part of your hypothesis, right? Like you're using the theory of evolution to generate a hypothesis for what transitional anatomy you would predict to find in these fossils. So that's just your methodology of how you're coming up with the prediction. What I'm asking about is, why is it that those predictions are matched by the reality of the fossils that we find? Are we just getting lucky over and over and over again?
No, you're not. What you're doing is assuming that if you find a fossil, it's actually a transitional form.
Nope.
Now, you can say it's morphologically transitional, but the fossil you find is dead. It's not doing anything. You have no idea what its DNA is. You have no idea. I mean, when I studied genetics, I deliberately did that at Queensland University just to check how you could do living things. and you could arrange the flies and everything else showing transitional forms, but then you discovered that a different arrangement of DNA produced similar effects, or a similar arrangement of DNA produced different effects.
I can
call it
grant
transition if you like, but it's got nothing to do with what we call evolution.
Yeah, okay, look, for the sake of this argument, I can grant that every single fossil that's ever been found had no children and had no descendants of any kind. I can grant you to that entirely. It doesn't change my argument in the least. The argument is that using, like, all of these could be sister clades, right? These could just be sister groups and not the true ancestral transitional forms. It doesn't matter. What matters is that using evolutionary theory, the actual anatomy was predicted beforehand. Anatomies that we don't see in living things anymore. Like the Tiktaalik anatomy, we don't see that. We don't see like the way that synapsids, like the therapsid jaws form to the base of their skulls. We don't see Archaeopteryx with unfused digits on their wings. Like we don't see these anatomies, but they were predicted using evolution. And then we found fossils that have those transitional anatomic features themselves. I don't care if you say that these are not ancestral and you can't prove their genetic relationships. That doesn't matter to my question.
Well, I can't disagree with your question because there is some reality there, but it's a meaningless reality, right? The fact is, God created this, God created that. You arrange it in a great cycle of being like Archimedes did, and that before creation versus evolution, but they're essentially gods of some sort of order or disorder, and you end up with a great chain of being, which you can argue is or even isn't evolution, and you can put them in an arrangement of order. You could predict to try and fit them in, but in reality, every time we've found living things and put them in an order, you can then say, well, something should fit in there. And to which you say, so.
Yeah,
there's
but
no benefit to what you are saying there as a means of explanation at all.
So you're making testable predictions that are falsifiable, and then we're verifying those predictions, and those predictions were made using the theory of evolution. This is how all scientific theories are validated. So, like, the fact that you can use evolution to make these predictions of anatomies, like, are you trying to make the case that you could use creationism to predict novel anatomies in the fossil record before that they're found? And if so, why hasn't that ever been done?
Okay, it has been done. Read Stephen Gould, and the reason he ended up with his hopeful monster theory is he said creation works better than evolution for predicting where your groups are going to be. And they fall essentially into biblical characters in which each group is separate and unrelated. Read Stephen Gould on his hopeful monster theory, and he would disagree with you.
So what did Stephen Gould predict? Which fossil?
Basically, his statement is that you will find them, they fit best into creation categories.
That's so there isn't any specific fossil that he predicted should exist beforehand?
No, because once you find a fossil, your statement that it fits in between A and B assumes the bottom layer got there first, assumes the fossil order represents time, assumes evolution. Right, so you're going round and round in circles, and Stephen Gould, like Professor Ager, like my Professor Carter, said once the fossil appears, it seems to be inherently stable. There is no evolution, even if your classification system puts it between A and C. It is meaningless,
so
purely theoretical.
If evolution was true, then you would expect to find a fossil that had anatomy in between A and B. That's the prediction.
If creation is true.
Why would creation make that same prediction?
Because creation would predict that you would find a group of creatures that would fit the environment they're designed for. And if they needed intermediate features like frogs and fish versus human beings, that's an intermediate in a real sense. And you could predict it if you like, or predict you'll find a salamander that's half toad and halfway towards marsupial or a mammal or whatever. So the predictability is purely logical sequence, but logic is not true. It's just reasonable.
So it's interesting because with the creation model, if all these were separate ancestries, you could predict intermediate anatomies in between any two groups of animals. But in evolution, that's not the case. You can only predict intermediate anatomies between two closely related groups. So that's a difference between the creation and the evolution model. And when we look at the fossils, we see transitional anatomies between closely related groups like evolution predicts, and we don't find transitional anatomies between two distantly related groups in the evolution model.
I'll disagree with you because I know how we got those creatures that are A, B, and C, and we found B1 and B2, and we put them there based on our belief in time, our belief in the order of the rocks, our belief in index fossils. And if you just found it by itself in Australia, you probably wouldn't have done that. But it's not a prediction that confirms evolution. It may be consistent with what they teach you evolution is, but there's no problem with saying, well, God made this, and the evidence shows it was different at the start. The evidence shows it was different at the finish if it's died out, or the evidence shows it's still different and not transitioning anywhere at the present time. The real world is the best evidence against your argument.
Right. So in the real world, we have a track record of confirmed predictions made using the theory of evolution, from therapsids, Archaeopteryx, Tiktaalik,
Yeah.
like et cetera, like Sphecomirma. Like there's a lot that I could list off. But there is a track record of exactly 0 times that the creation model has been used to generate a prediction for a certain anatomy in the fossil record that has then gone on to be found. So just comparing the real world track record of these two things.
Okay, the real track record is if you find beetles with wings on the mainland of Australia, given the history of the world as devolution, you can predict that somewhere beetles will be found without wings because they've devolved. So these are predictions you could make if you want to, same as we did with the snakes tonight. The Christians would have said, we will find snakes with legs, right? And that's exactly what's happened. So you're absolutely incorrect in saying this is unpredictable, it's usable. But Donnie, I hate to say this, my grandson's just come out of the house. I've got to go and check with my wife now. Sorry, guys, my wife has got dementia and I need to go and check how she's getting on.
Wait, before you go, can you just tell me who was the creationist who predicted snakes with legs should be found?
Me.
You. So
I
you
did
predicted
this
this
at
before.
Queensland University many years ago. I wrote a textbook on Search for the Origin of Life, which you can have a look at. I gave a lecture series to the Canadian Education Group after having won a debate against 4 professors at once in Saskatchewan. So the track record is there as to what creationists can predict. Right? Creation is very predictable, that things will produce after their kind, even if you think they're transitional. That's the world you live in. That's why Stephen Gould said, traditionally, the creationists have been the best of the geologists, not the evolutionists. Derek Ager says the same. Read it up. And Donnie, I'm going to have to bid you farewell, mate, after 2.5 hours. And really good to meet you, mate.
Yeah. So as you can see, Mackay is just going to be taking credit for predicting snake transitional fossils somehow. I mean, just ignoring the fact that these snake transitionals were predicted decades beforehand using the theory of evolution. If we take John at face value of what he's saying, that he predicted it because it's not evolution, it's devolution.
So the history is not the one shown in the textbooks with an always upwards sort of a concept, but it's the reality of that. Downwards, devolution.
Well, that also ignores the fact that snakes have lots of anatomical features that are unique to snakes and are not part of lizards. Like they have really developed sensory organs or venom mechanisms or different kinds of ear structures, sexual reproduction mechanisms and organs. There's lots of things that are just not. You can't just draw a line from lizards to snakes and say that's devolution because they've only lost limbs. It doesn't work like that. Snakes have a lot of things that are also highly developed and derived compared to lizards. John Mackay here claims that he can predict devolutionary transitions, which also kind of seems like you're going from one kind of animal to another, right? So I don't know if he just disagrees with Kent Hovind or if he just debunked Kent Hovind's you never see one kind go from another, because lizards to snakes, 2 kinds. You can't have it both ways, creationists. Ignoring all of that, I brought up multiple examples of transitionals that were not simply devolution. They're not just losing limbs. Like, is it a devolution to go from a chimp-like ape ancestor to a human? Is that devolution? Because transitions were predicted and found. We've got lots of them. Australopithecus, Ardipithecus, Sahelanthropus, Homo habilis. We've got tons of missing links in that tree. Is it devolution to go from theropod dinosaurs to birds that could fly? Is that devolution? Because there's tons and tons of transitions that are pretty obviously not devolutions Although, you know, lizards and snakes, already not devolutions. But there's tons of counterexamples that John Mackay just has no explanation for. And in response to all this weight, all this pretty irrefutable patterns of tested, verified predictions made by evolution and transitional fossils that were discovered after they were predicted, in response to all that, he just says, well, I can do it too. Look, I predicted a snake devolution transitional. And I think during his whole rant there, he said that you could make a prediction between salamanders and kangaroos.
Or predict you'll find a salamander that's half toad and halfway towards marsupial or a mammal or whatever.
Okay. So if creation model is predicting transitions between salamanders and kangaroos, John, you're gonna have to show me those fossils. I would love to see them. Yeah. It really is remarkable how just in that very short clip, how much John Mackay tried to avoid the subject, tried to change it, tried to steal valor, basically, by claiming that he had actually made these predictions of transitional fossils that he doesn't even think are transitional or exist. Oh my gosh, there was so much running. And his partner, Indiana Joe, just conveniently left the call like right before I even got there. So yeah, if this is the best they got, sorry guys, they're gonna have to do better. I just want to have another 1v1 debate where creationists will actually sit and have a discussion about evolution with me. Is that too much to ask at this point, or every time I show up, they've got to go? Oh, and check out this sweet trilobite fossil I just got. Isn't it freaking cool? I named him Anaximander. Anyways, guys, as always, remember to keep learning, stay curious, and stay tuned for next time.